Hey fellas, what's up? Hope you're keeping well. Just wanted to make another video quick because there's another thing I wanted to talk about is I believe if I was born 20 years earlier, like in I'd say about 1970, I think 1970 would be the sweet spot. I think if I was born around those years, I would not have the problems I currently have in my life, you know? Because sometimes I think I simply wasn't born in the right decade because of the way things are going. And I believe if I was born in 1970, things would have been different for me growing up. I mean, I was raised in a very religious household, and I think growing up in a religious household, especially nowadays, that leaves you very unprepared for what the real world is like. Like, being taught that being a good person and believing in God, having a good personality, being taught that that is the way to be to succeed in the world, that leaves you open for massive failure. Because in today's world, people don't believe in God anymore. They've abandoned God and they've abandoned morality in favour of degeneratism and selfishness and vanity. And if you just go out and just look at go on any social media site or go watch mainstream TV or just go out and observe people, and you'll notice that people value vanity and appearance over anything else. Like, because just look at the stuff that society throws at you in like on YouTube even. The, 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 the videos that get millions of views, it's always some good looking person in them, or a good looking woman or something like that. Or thirst traps as they call them. Like, Facebook and all is filled with that, and you know. And the thing is, this stuff didn't really exist in what did I say, about 40 years ago, like in the 70s to the 80s. I think it existed back then, but it wasn't constantly bombarded on us by every aspect of society. Like, you go watch MTV, like music videos from the 80s, and some of those are a bit, sexualized, but it wasn't constantly thrown in your face like it is nowadays, you know? It wasn't constantly thrown in your face by social media, like all these thirst traps and all this, or, stuff like that. Like, and there wasn't, because there was no internet back then, people had to actually go out and speak to people. Like, if you wanted social interaction, you had to go out and get it, because there was simply no choice, you know? Like, there was no dating apps, so you have to actually go out and look for someone to date. Whereas nowadays, you just turn your phone on and keep swiping until you find someone. And lookism, the dating apps made lookism a big thing, because only certain fellas are getting things on those, you know. Like, any average guy could, back in the 80s or 90s, he could just go out and meet a woman in a bar or whatever, or any place, the park even. But that doesn't happen nowadays for average looking men. Only the top 10% of men are getting that option now. And you know, another thing, I'm big into music. Like, I used to play like games, video games, like the Tony Hawk games, the skateboarding games, and those kind of shaped my music taste, like punk rock and all this. And I feel like if I was born in 1970 or around that time, I feel like I would have grown up in the golden age of music, like, because we had all sorts of great bands and great singers back then. Like, you had the Ramones and the Sex Pistols. They were the kind of first to popularize punk rock, and I would have grown up listening to them probably, and I probably would have gotten into music, and once I came of age in 1990, I suppose, I probably would have grown up and made my own punk rock band because a lot of the guys who were in punk bands during the 90s, they grew up listening to that kind of music, and then they went on to form their own bands, you know. But nowadays, that kind of punk music isn't viable to even make anymore because there's some bands from back then that are still going strong, but the majority are not going strong. Like, there's no new people making that kind of music because it just doesn't. Like, punk rock was never a popular genre, but you could at least, in the old days, you could at least make that kind of music and, somewhat live off of it. But nowadays, you couldn't do that. And, because nobody listens to that kind of music anymore. It's all, if you notice, every song nowadays is all copied from decades back. You know, like anytime I've happened to put on the radio, like I don't listen to it, but I occasionally in the car I'll hear it, or if someone in my roommate is playing it, um, the news station where they play all the pop hits, it's always copies of old songs, and you know there's no originality in music anymore. It's always people who are born into wealth who make so of themselves in the music industry now. Because I noticed that about a lot of singers now, that they were already born to wealth, so they had to put no work in whatsoever to actually achieve their success, and that's what it is with a lot of people nowadays. If you're not born into a certain position in life, then it's basically over for you. You know, like especially if you were born without the best looks or without the best mental health or whatever, then that's going to be a very, very big obstacle for you. That people who were not born with that, they don't have to deal with that. You know, like, so yeah. If I was born in around 1970 or a little bit before that, maybe, I think the problems I have now would just be not exist at all. I think that a lot of people, if they were born in that era, they wouldn't have those problems either. And and you can see, and when you speak to guys who were born in that era around 1970 or 1960, they they have a completely different mentality to people who were born in the 90s. Like, because the way they carry themselves, the way they speak, it's clear that they've had success in life. And with a lot of Gen Z people, they feel like they haven't had any success, and these people who were born in 1970 or so, they don't understand how the world is now. They think it's still the way it used to be, even though there's plenty of evidence out there saying that it's not the way it used to be. But they're still stuck in the glory days of their youth, and they think everything works the same way. And that's why it's so frustrating trying to explain to people who are of an older generation to you. That's why it's so frustrating to actually explain to them your problems, because they just don't get it. And I wish I was like them. I wish I could just be born in an earlier era, an earlier decade, and just, coast through life without any problems, without any real problems, just be able to buy a house, because houses are very expensive now. And that's another thing, that it wasn't like that in the past. I'd be able to buy a house, and, I could just, because there was no dating apps to mess up women's expectations, I could just go out and just go to a bar or just do anything, and it just happened for me, because I know it would, because there's fellas who are even worse looking than me, who were born in that era, who seemingly got a load of women after them, you know, and it's just it just shows you that the decade in which you're born in, that's going to determine your look in life. That's going to determine how your life goes. Like, certain people, if you're born with really good looks, you can bypass being born in the 90s, but for a lot of people, they can't. For 90% of men, they can't bypass that because most men are average and there's nothing particularly attractive about them and there's nothing particularly ugly about them. But that's just, either way, that's a turn off to women nowadays, which I think women in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, to an extent, they weren't as picky as they are nowadays because there was no dating apps back then, and there was no expectations, like high expectations. Like, you were stuck with the guys in your neighborhood or the guys in your city, and most of them were average guys. So you just had to deal with it. Like, you didn't have the option nowadays of waiting forever and going on a dating app and waiting just to wait until some guy who is top 10% looks. You didn't have the option of just waiting for him, you know. But a lot of women, even nowadays, they want the guy who's top 10% looks, but they can't find him because he's just so elusive, and so they won't date. They won't even date average guys. So, you know, and people back in the olden days, people used to go to church and they'd form connections through there, and but church has been completely eradicated from modern life. Like, people don't believe in God anymore, and they don't follow His word, and it's led them in a path of self destruction. Basically, it's led society into a path of self destruction, and I don't think it can be fixed unless that sense of community is brought back. And like, that's why I keep saying people who grow up in religious households, like myself, we were not prepared for the way the world would turn out because it just happened so quickly. I think in the last, I want to say, 15, 20 years, that's when things really started to change from the olden ways into this new modern ways we have now. And people, some people still think it is the way it used to be, and they still won't believe that. Looks. It's all about looks nowadays and vanity, but people still won't believe that it is. Like, they still think the world works the way it was. But people have to wake up and realize that things are different now, and you know, I believe that if I was born in about 20 years earlier than I was, I don't believe I'd have the problems I have in life. You know, because with the housing crisis and the dating crisis and the family crisis and just everything like that, it was just so much easier back in the day to achieve that nuclear family lifestyle with a wife and kids and a house, that 1950s style thing. Like, it was so much easier to attain that, but for nowadays, most fellas are just going to have to resign themselves to the fact that they won't achieve that, and it's a very depressing thing. But I don't know how it's going to change unless social media is banned, but that's never going to happen. We all know it's not going to happen, and things are not going to go back to the way they were. So, there's nothing to do but deal with it, and it's very depressing, but it's just the way it is. The past is gone, and you know, so is everything good in the past is gone, and you know, all that good music. Even the movies back then were better. Like, I don't think anyone will disagree with me on that, because most movies now are just the same thing, like superhero stuff. And you had variety in movies back then, but you know, and you had more people going to the cinema as well. So, you know, like, people going to the cinema was a big event, and I've heard of people meeting their wife at the cinema back in the day, and that wouldn't happen nowadays. So that's another thing that would have been different about. my life perhaps, because I'm big into movies as well, but the movie theater experience now is completely different than it was back years ago, because people don't have proper etiquette anymore. They just do whatever they want. They'll throw popcorn around. They'll make all sorts of noise, and people have just lost. It's a degenerate society with no morals, when people have just lost their way. But yeah, and the drinking culture as well, like going to bars and all that, was different years ago, because it wasn't about getting completely out of your head on drink and just tripping over yourself and throwing up. It was just about going to a place to relax and have a drink or two and just relax. And people would. My parents always tell me about, and my grandparents as well. They always tell me about how people back then would meet their future wife or their future husband in a bar, and that sort of thing is unfathomable now. You know, because it's just it doesn't happen anymore, especially if you're not a guy who's deemed attractive by women. And because it's all done on dating apps now, and it's all about the looks, it's all about the vanity. And this society we have is based on vanity, because everywhere you look, it's all the things people value now is looks and clout, money, and all that kind of stuff. So it just is the way it is, and things were better. Things. I wish we could go back to the old ways, but it's just not going to happen at this point. All we can do is just fantasize about it, and fantasize about me being born in 1970 and then going on to start a punk rock band and probably getting success out of that. But nowadays, that's a pipe dream. And I bet you all had dreams like that at one point, and it was blown out the window for you, because of this society we live in now, where there's no connection between anyone, and it's all about materialism and hedonism and stuff like that. No true connections between people. And, well, I think I made my point. So you have a good day, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.